In this video, we'll be tackling what loops are, the three types of loops, and how each loop works step by step. Okay, let's begin. Loops are something that repeats a task over and over and over again. Well, more specifically, it repeats a block of code a specified number of times, either through user input or specified within the program. There are three types of loops: the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. And while you can do a lot of programming on all three loops that could be similar to each other, there are actually some subtle differences between them that are very important to take note of. What I have here on this program is something that prints out hello world 10 times. I have done this manually through cout commands from line 9 to 18, as you can see here. If I did print this and run this, this will print out hello world 10 times onto the console line, as you can see here. However, this takes up a bulk of space in programming, and this is repetitive. There should be some better way to do this. Well, one might say that you should use a loop, and that's what we're going to do. That's what loops are for. The for you is an example of a for loop that prints out hello world about 10 times. And I'm going to run that here just so you can see what's happening. And onto the terminal, it prints out hello world 10 times. So what I've gone and done effectively is I've reduced 10 lines of code of manually printing out hello world into 3 lines of code, which loops over and over and over again and repeats the same task. But how does the for loop work? How exactly does it do that? So let's dissect this for loop. The for loop starts with the keyword for, followed by these 3 parts: int I equals 0, I less than 10, and then I increment. What is happening here is the first part, called initialization. Initialization means declaring a variable for use in the for loop. So what's happening here is we're declaring a variable I and assigning the value 0. Let's write that down here onto the right in a comment so we can take note of what's happening. I is less than 10. This is called the test part of the syntax. It's checking whether or not this is true. And since we know that I is equals to 0, this is effectively saying I less than 10. It checks 0 less than 10, which is true, and if it returns a true value, it's going to print out hello world and execute the body of the for loop. After executing the whole body of the for loop, which in this case is just the hello world, it's going to move back into the for loop, and it's going to go into the third part. It's going to then increment the I variable. So now the I variable plus 1 is 1. We're going to then check that again in the test, and this time it isn't 0. I is now equals to 1. And since 1 is less than 10, which makes it true, it's going to execute this body of code again, cout hello world, and go back into the for loop and then increment it again. So it's going to be now 2. And then again, it's going to compare that variable to 10, so 2 less than 10, and then it's going to keep incrementing over and over and over till it reaches 9. So what do you think happens when it reaches 9? It's going to check, right? 9 is less than 10. It's true. So it's going to execute this block of code, but then we go back into the for loop, and it's going to increment this again, but now 10 isn't less than 10, because 10 is equals to 10. This is now a false value. So once this is a false value, it's going to move out of this for loop and into here, outside of the curly brace. So that's how the for loop works. Let me give you a quick rundown here. It's going to initialize this variable, I equals 0. It's going to check that variable and compare it to this one, and it's going to increment that value, I plus plus. Every time this middle part is true, it's going to execute this block of code. And once this is a false value, it's going to go out here and out of the loop. Did you get that? Okay, let's move on to while loops next, and I'm going to explain what's happening here. So this is an example of printing out hello world 10 times again, but this time with a while loop. I'm going to run this, and as you can see, printed out hello world 10 times. So how does the while loop work? So the condition or the syntax for a while loop is to check whether or not this is true or false. If it's true, then it's going to execute this block of code, aka the beginning and end of these curly braces. So whatever's inside of these is going to run. We have cout hello world and then increment for I. I've initialized a variable outside of the while loop, which is int I equals 0. And then I'm comparing that variable inside of here in this while loop. So I'm evaluating whether or not this is true or false. And we're going to substitute that here in a comment. We have I less than 10. We know that I equals 0. So 0 is less than 10. This is true. So it's going to execute the inside of this code, which is to print out hello world and then to increment. And since we know that 0 incremented is just 1, then we're going to evaluate this yet again, and it's going to return a true value. So this is true. We're going to then print out hello world and then increment it again. And this process goes over and over again until you reach 9. And then after evaluating this and then printing cout hello world, it's going to increment yet again. And it's going to check whether or not this is true. But 10 isn't less than 10. 10 is equals to 10. So 10 less than 10 returns false. So since this is false, this is going to move out and into here. Okay, let's move on to do-while loops. Do-while loops and while loops are very similar in syntax and also how they function, but there is one key difference between them. The difference being is that do-while loops are guaranteed to run the body once. So do-while loops will run the code and then check the condition, but while loops will check the condition and then run the body. So what do I mean by this? We'll go through the code here. What we have here is a do-while loop that prints out hello world once. So let's run this and see what's happening. Okay, so I've initialized a variable outside of this do-while loop, and I've said that I equals 0. And then I have this do-while loop, which is indicated by the keywords do and while. And do inside of this is the body. It's going to execute this once. So cout hello world, this is going to print it, and then increment I, and then this is going to check whether or not this condition is true, and if it is, it'll continue doing whatever is inside of this body. Okay? So we know that it's going to be only running once because we've set this number to 1. So I have the integer I equals 0 here. We're going to substitute this onto a comment. Let's say 0 is less than 1, which is true. So it's going to run this code, and then it's going to increment. So now 1 is less than 1. But we know this isn't true. 1 is less than 1. So this is going to evaluate to false. So what happens when a condition gets evaluated to false in loops? It moves out into here. But see what happens if I set this value to 0. And I'm going to remove everything else here. It still prints hello world, and that's got me curious. Why is it printing hello world? So what's happening here is it's going through the body, doing it once, and then checking whether or not this is true. But since it's false, it immediately moves out because 0 isn't less than 0. So since it's false, it moves out into here. But it still prints hello world because it's a do-while loop. It's guaranteed to run at least once. All right, now let's go through nested for loops. This is a bit difficult to wrap your head around, especially with all these variables to keep track of, but I promise you it's actually not that difficult. So what we have here is a nested for loop inside of this for loop. We're going to dub these loops the outer loop for this one. This is the outer loop, and this is the inner loop. Okay? I'm going to comment onto the side here what we're going to be going through. So from we know earlier, we are initializing this variable, so I is equals to 0. And then we're going to substitute that value in this condition. So I less than 2, 0 less than 2. We're going to say and check whether or not this is true. And yes, 0 is less than 2, which is true. And it's going to move into this block of code. So the block of code that the for loop holds is this one, this inner for loop. We're going to then do this inner for loop. And we're going to say, hey, int j equals 0. We're going to then substitute that again because this condition compares it to the number 2, 0 less than 2, which is also true. And we know that if it evaluates this into true, then it's going to run this code. After it runs this code, what happens? Does it end? Actually not. What happens is we're going to go back into this for loop and we're going to increment j. So we know that j earlier was equals to 0, increment that, which is going to be 1, and then we're going to substitute that into the condition 1 less than 2, which is still true. It's going to run this code again, and then we're going to go back into this for loop, increment it, and it's now going to be 2. But now this time, the condition is going to actually evaluate to false, because 2 isn't less than 2. So what happens? Are we just going to end this for loop? Not exactly. What's going to happen is we're going to go back to this outer loop here, and we're going to increment I. So now I is equals to 1. But then what happens to this one? Does it keep the values? It doesn't. What's going to happen is we're going to have to redo this whole for loop, but this time in the incremented version. So since I is now equals to 1, and then we're going to evaluate that, 1 is less than 2, which is true, it's going to go back into the inner loop, and then we're going to do this again. J equals 0, and then j is less than 2, which is 0 less than 2. And it's going to evaluate the true. It's going to do this code again, and then increment it again, and then again, and then it's false again, and then it's going to go back into this outer loop, and it's going to increment again. But this time, it's actually false. So since this outer loop is already false, there's no reason to go back into the inner loop, and instead, it's going to move out into here. So what's happening as a summary is every time you go through the iteration, so this is the, let's say, the 0th index, or the 0th time it's happening, it's going to loop through this and complete this inner loop. After this inner loop finishes, it then goes out to the outer loop, and then increments, and then goes into the first iteration, and it's going to check this condition, and it's going to do this inner loop again. So for every time you increment in this outer loop, you're going to redo this inner loop, as you can see here. So 0, and then 0, and then 0, and then j increments, and then since it's false evaluation now, it goes into the first iteration. So I equals 1 now, but j is equals to 0 because we evaluated j into 0. I equals to 1, and then j equals to 1. So that's how nested for loops work.